Continuing the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. We are in lecture 20, conclusions. But to do this, it has to implore the aid of the bull's fat and other portions of the unguent. The reason why bull's fat is so powerful is that the bull at the time of slaughter is full of secret reluctancy and vindictive murmurs, and therefore dies with a higher flame of revenge about him than any other animal. Now, there's a way of slaughtering animals which they kind of go along with it. You kind of avoid showing them the knife and all that sort of stuff. Certainly not the modern way is better. And thus we have made it out, says this author, that the admirable efficacy of the ointment ought to be imputed not to any auxiliary concurrence of Satan, but simply to the energy of the posthumous character of revenge, remaining firmly impressed upon the blood and concreted fat in the unguent. J.B. van Helmont, A Ternary Paradoxes, translated by Walter Charlton, 1650. William James much abridges the original in his citations. And there's not the dots, so you don't necessarily know where, right? The author goes on to prove by the analogy of many other natural facts that this sympathetic action between things at a distance is the true rationale of the case. If, he says, the heart of a horse slain by a witch, taken out of the yet reeking carcass, be impaled upon an arrow and roasted immediately, the whole witch becomes tormented with the unsufferable pains and cruelty of the fire, which could by no means happen unless there preceded a conjunction of the spirit of the witch with the spirit of the horse. In the reeking and yet panting heart, the spirit of the witch is kept captive, and the retreat of it prevented by the arrow transfixed. Similarly hath not many a murdered carcass at the corners in quest suffered a fresh hemorrhage or crunation at the presence of the assassin, the blood being, as in a furious fit of anger, enraged and agitated by the impress of revenge conceived against the murderer at the instant of the soul's compulsive exile from the body. So if you have dropsy, gout, or jaundice, by including some of your warm blood in the shell and white of an egg, which exposed to a gentle heat and mixed with a bait of flesh, ye shall give to a hungry dog or hog, the disease shall instantly pass from you to the animal and leave you entirely. And similarly, again, if you burn some of the milk either of a cow or of a woman, the gland from which it issued will dry up. A gentleman at Brussels had his nose mowed off in combat, but the celebrated surgeon Tagliacozzus digged a new nose for him out of the skin of the arm of a porter at Bologna. About 13 months after his return into his own country, the engrafted nose grew cold, putrefied, and a few days dropped off, and it was then discovered that the porter had expired near about the same punctilio of time. There are still at Brussels eyewitnesses of this occurrence, says Van Helmont, and adds, I pray, what is there in this of superstition or of exalted imagination? Modern mind-cure literature, the works of Prentice Mulford, for example, is full of sympathetic magic. And back to the regular text, how indeed could it be otherwise? The extraordinary value for explanation and provision of those mathematical and mechanical modes of conception which science uses was a result that could not possibly have been expected in advance. Weight, movement, velocity, direction, position, what thin, pallid, uninteresting ideas. How could the richer animistic aspects of nature, the peculiarities and oddities that make phenomena picturesquely striking or impressive, fail to have been first singled out and followed by philosophy as the more promising avenue to the knowledge of nature's life? Well, it is still in these richer animistic and dramatic aspects that religion delights to dwell. It is the terror and beauty of phenomena, the promise of the dawn and of the rainbow, the voice of the thunder, the gentleness of the summer rain, the sublimity of the stars, and not the physical laws which these things follow, by which the religious mind still continues to be most impressed. And just as of yore the devout man tells you that in the solitude of his room or of the fields he still feels the divine presence, that inflowings of help come in reply to his prayers, and that sacrifices to this unseen reality fill him with security and peace. Pure anachronism, says the survival theory, anachronism for which de-anthropomorphization of the imagination is the remedy required. The less we mix the private with the cosmic, the more we dwell in universal and impersonal terms, the truer heirs of science we become, in spite of the appeal which this impersonality of the scientific attitude makes to a certain magnanimity of temper. I believe it to be shallow, and I can now state my reason in comparatively few words. That reason is that, so long as we deal with the cosmic and general, we deal only with the symbols of reality, but as soon as we deal with private and personal phenomena, as such, we deal with realities in the completest sense of the term. I think I can easily make clear what I mean by these words. And Joseph Campbell kind of focused on that, is that people want a personal experience of life. They don't just want some meaning of life, but the world of our experience. I said Campbell, not Campbell, right? The world of our experience consists at all times of two parts, an objective and a subjective part, of which the former may be incalculably more extensive than the latter, and yet the latter can never be omitted or suppressed. The objective part is the sum total whatsoever at any given time we may be thinking of. The subjective part is the inner state in which the thinking comes to pass. What we think may be enormous, the cosmic times and space, for example, whereas the inner state may be the most fugitive and paltry activity of the mind. Yet the cosmic objects, so far as the experience yields them, are but ideal pictures of something whose existence we do not inwardly possess, but only point at outwardly. While the inner state is our very experience itself, its reality and that of our experience are one. A conscious field plus its object as felt are thought of, plus an attitude towards the object, plus the sense of a self to whom the attitude belongs. Such a concrete bit of personal experience may be a small bit, but it is a solid bit as long as it lasts. Not hollow, not a mere abstract element of experience, such as the object is when taken all alone. It is a full fact. Even though it be an insignificant fact, it is of the kind to which all realities whatsoever must belong. The motor currents of the world run through the like of it. It is on the line connecting real events with real events. That unshareable feeling which each one of us has of the pinch of his individual destiny as he privately feels it rolling out on fortune's wheel may be disparaged for its egotism, may be sneered at as unscientific, but it is the one thing that fills up the measure of our concrete actuality, and any would be existent that should lack such a feeling or its analog would be a piece of reality only half made up. Compare Lotz's doctrine that the only meaning we can attach to the notion of thing as in itself is by conceiving it as it is for itself, i.e., the piece of a full experience with the private sense of a pinch or interactivity of some sort going with it. If this be true, it is absurd for science to say that the egotistic elements of experience should be suppressed. The axis of reality runs solely through the egotistic places. They are strung upon it like so many beads to describe the world with all the various feelings of the individual pinch of destiny, the various spiritual attitudes left out from the description. They being as describable as anything else would be something like offering a printed bill of fare as the equivalent for a solid meal. Religion makes no such blunder. The individual's religion may be egotistic, and those private realities which it keeps in touch with may be narrow enough, but at any rate it always remains infinitely less hollow and abstract as far as it goes than a science which prides itself on taking no account of anything private at all. A bill of fare with one real raisin on it, instead of the word raisin, with a one real egg instead of the word egg, might be an inadequate meal, but it would at least be a commencement of reality. The contention of survival theory that we ought to stick to non-personal elements exclusively seems like saying that we ought to be satisfied forever with reading the naked bill of fare. I think, therefore, that however particular questions connected with our individual destinies may be answered, it is only by acknowledging them as genuine questions and living in the sphere of thought which they open up that we become profound. But to live thus is to be religious. So I unhesitatingly repudiate the survival theory of religion as being founded on an egregious mistake. It does not follow, because our ancestors made so many errors of fact and mixed them with their religion, that we should therefore leave off being religious at all. Even the errors of fact may possibly turn out not to be as wholesale as a scientist assumes. We saw in Lecture 4 how the religious conception of the universe seems to be, to many mind curers, verified from day to day by their experience of fact. Experience of fact is a field with so many things in it that a sectarian scientist, methodically declining as he does to recognize such facts as mind cures and others like them experience otherwise than by such rude heads, a classification as bosh, rot, folly, certainly leaves out a mass of raw fact which, save for the industrious interest of the religious in the more personal aspects of reality, would never have succeeded in getting anything of itself recorded at all. We know this to be true already in certain cases. It may therefore be true in others as well. Miraculous healings have always been part of the supernaturalist stock in trade, and have always been dismissed by the scientist as figments of the imagination. But the scientist's tardy education in the facts of hypnotism has recently given him an apperceiving mass for phenomena of this order, and he consequently now allows that the healings may exist, provided you expressly call them effects of suggestion. Even the stigmata of the cross on St. Francis's hands and feet may, on these terms, not be may not be a fable. Similarly, the time-honored phenomena of a diabolical possession is on the point of being admitted by the scientist as a fact. Now he has the name of hysterodemonopathy by which to apperceive it. No one can foresee just how far this legitimation of occult phenomena under newly found scientists' titles may proceed. Even prophecy, even levitation might creep into the pale. Thus the divorce between scientist facts and religious facts may not necessarily be as eternal as it at first sight seems, nor the personalism and romanticism of the world, as they appeared to primitive thinking, be matters so irrevocably outgrown. The final human opinion may, in short, in some manner now impossible to foresee, revert to the more personal style, just as any path of progress may follow a spiral rather than a straight line. If this were so, the rigorously impersonal view of science might one day appear as having been a temporarily useful eccentricity, rather than the definitively triumphant position which the sectarian scientist at present so confidently announces it to be. By being religious, we establish ourselves in possession of ultimate reality at the only points at which reality is given us to guard. Our responsible concern is with our private destiny, after all. you see now why I have been so individualistic throughout these lectures, and why I have seemed so bent on rehabilitating the element of feeling in religion and subordinating its intellectual part. Individuality is founded in feeling, and the recesses of feeling, the darker, blinder strata of character, are the only places in the world in which we catch real fact in the making, and directly perceive how events happen and how work is actually done. And before I get into this next quote, let's remember that mythology is supposed to be a working of facts. It's not mere ideology. It's a spiritual relationship to ideology. And mythology, even in the biblical, the word myth in the Bible doesn't mean something untrue, and that one verse qualifies it. It's it's a invented myth. So there's a difference between a made-up myth and, a myth. Of course, some invented myths turn out to be true, but at the very least, they represent use. They represent truth or good or whatever. Hume's criticism has banished causation from the world of physical objects, and science is absolutely satisfied to define cause in terms of concomitant change. Read Mach, Pearson, Ostwald. The original of the notion of causation is in our interpersonal experience, and only there can causes in the old-fashioned sense be directly observed and described. Compared with this world of living individualized feelings, the world of generalized objects which the intellect contemplates is without solidity or life, as in a stereoscopic or kinetoscopic picture seen outside the instrument. The third dimension, the movement, the vital element are not there. We get a beautiful picture of an express train supposed to be moving, where in the picture, as I have heard a friend say, is the energy R, the 50 miles an hour. When I read in a religious paper words like these, perhaps the best thing we can say of God is that he is the inevitable inference. I recognize the tendency to let religion evaporate in the intellectual terms would the martyrs have sung in the flames for a mere interference, however inevitable it might be. Original religious men like St. Francis, Luther, Beckmann have usually been enemies of the intellect's pretension to meddle with religious things, yet the intellect, everywhere evasive, shows everywhere its shallowing effect. See how the ancient spirit of Methodism evaporates under those wonderfully able rationalistic booklets, which everyone should read, of a philosopher like Professor Bohn, The Christian Revelation, The Christian Life, The Atonement, Cincinnati and New York, 1898, 1899, 1900. See the positively expulsive purpose of philosophy, properly so called. Religion, writes M. Vacarat, La Religion, Paris, 1869, page 313, 436. At Passam, answers to a transient state or condition, not to a permanent determination of human nature being merely an expression of that stage of the human mind which is dominated by the imagination. Christianity has but a single possible final heir to its estate, and that is scientific philosophy. In a still more radical vein, Professor Herbert, Psychologie des Sentiments, page 310, describes the evaporation of religion. He sums it up in a single formula: the ever-growing predominance of the rational intellectual element and the gradual fading out of the emotional element, this latter tending to enter into the group of purely intellectual sentiments. A religious sentiment properly so called, nothing survives at last save a vague respect for the unknowable X, which is a last relic of the fear, and a certain attraction towards the ideal, which is a relic of the love that characterized the earlier periods of religious growth. To state this more simply, religion tends to turn into religious philosophy. These are psychologically entirely different things, the one being a theoretic construction of ratiocination, whereas the other is the living work of a group of persons or of a great inspired leader calling into play the entire thinking and feeling organism of man. Now, of course, our word inspired has lost a lot of its strength when it became, motivated, sure thing. You figure out some idea from something and it stirs you. Not quite the same thing as having a direct spiritual involvement, like the word inspiration implied, right? I find the same failure to recognize that the stronghold of religion lies individually in attempts like those of Professor Baldwin, Mental Development, Social and Ethical Interpretations, Chapter 10, and Mr. H.R. Marshall, Instinct and Reason, Chapters 8 to 12, make it a purely conservative social force. Let us agree, then, that religion occupying herself with personal destinies and keeping thus in contact with the only absolute realities which we know must necessarily play an eternal part in human history. The next thing to decide is what she reveals about those destinies, whether indeed she reveals anything distinctly enough to be considered a general message to mankind. We have done as you see with our preliminaries, and our final summing up can now begin. I am well aware that after all the palpitating documents which I have quoted, and all the perspectives of emotion-inspiring institution and belief that my previous lectures have opened, the dry analysis to which I now advance may appear to many of you like an anticlimax, a tapering off and flattening out of the subject instead of a crescendo of interest and results. I said a while ago that the religious attitude of Protestants appears poverty-stricken to the Catholic imagination. Still more poverty-stricken, I fear, may be my final summing up of the subject. Appear at first some of you. On which account I pray you now to bear this point in mind, that the present part of it, I am expressly trying to reduce religion to its lowest admissible terms, to that minimum free of individualistic excrescences, free from individualistic excrescences, which all religions contain as their nucleus, and on which it may be hoped that all religious persons may agree. That established, we should have a result which might be small, but would at least be solid, and on it, round it, the ruddier additional beliefs on which the different individuals make their venture might be grafted, and flourish as richly as you please. I shall add my own overbelief, which will be, I confess, of a somewhat pallid kind, as befits a critical philosopher, and you will, I hope, also add your overbeliefs, and we shall soon be in the varied world of concrete religious constructions once more. For the moment, let me dryly pursue the analytic part of the task. Both thought and feeling are determinants of conduct, and by the same conduct may be determined either by feeling or by thought. When we survey the whole field of religion, we find a great variety in the thoughts that have prevailed there, but the feelings on the one hand and the conduct on the other are almost always the same, for Stoic, Christian, and Buddhist saints are practically indistinguishable in their lives. The theories which religion generates, being thus variable, are secondary, and if you wish to grasp her essence, you must look to the feelings and the conduct as being the more constant elements. It is between these two elements that the short circuit exists on which she carries her principal business, while on the ideas and symbols and other institutions form loop lines, which may be perfections and improvements, and may even some day all be united in one harmonious system, but which are not to be regarded as organs with an indispensable function, necessary at all times for religious life to go on. This seems to me the first conclusion which we are entitled to draw from the phenomena which we have passed in review. The next step is to characterize the feelings. To what psychological order do they belong? The resultant outcome of them is, in any case, what Kant calls a sphenic affection, an excitement of the cheerful, expansive, dynamogenic order, which, like any tonic expressions are vital powers. In almost every lecture, but especially in the lectures on conversion and on saintliness, we have seen how this emotion overcomes temperamental melancholy and imparts endurance to the subject, are a zest, are a meaning, are the enchantment and glory to the common objects of life. Compare, for instances, on page 203, 219, 223, 226, 249 to 256, 275 to 278. The name of the name of faith state by which Professor Luba designates it is a good one. American Journal of Psychology, Volume 7, page 345. It is a biological as well as a psychological condition, and Tolstoy is absolutely accurate in classing faith among the forces by which men live. Above page 100, page 184. The total absence of it, anhedonia, means collapse. Above page 145. The faith state may hold a very minimum of intellectual content. We saw examples of this, and those sudden raptures of the divine presence are in such mystical seizures as Dr. Buck described. That 7th journal, page 400. It may be a mere vague enthusiasm, half spiritual, half vital, a courage and a feeling that great and wondrous things are in the air. Example, Henry Perive writes to Gratry, I do not know how to deal with the happiness which you aroused in me this morning. It overwhelms me. I want to do something, yet I can do nothing and am fit for nothing. I would fain do great things. Again, after an inspiring interview, he writes, I went homewards intoxicated with joy, hope, and strength. I wanted to feed upon my happiness in solitude, far from all men. It was late, but unheeding, then I took a mountain path and went on like a madman, looking at the heavens, regardless of the earth. Suddenly, an instinct made me draw hastily back. I was on the very edge of a precipice, one step more, and I must have fallen. I took fright and gave up my nocturnal promenade. A. Gratry, Henry Perive, London, 1872, pages 92 and 89. This primacy in the faith state of vague expansive impulse over direction is well expressed in Walt Whitman's lines, Leaves of Grass, 1872, page 190. Oh, to confront night, storms, hunger, ridicule, accidents, rebuffs, as the trees and animals do. Dear camarado, I confess I have urged you onward with me, and still urge you, without the least idea what is our destination, or whether we shall be victorious or utterly quelled and defeated. The readiness for great things and this sense that the world, by its importance, wonderfulness, etc., is apt for their production, would seem to be the undifferentiated germ of all the higher faiths. Trust in our own dreams of ambition are in the country's expansive destinies, and faith in the providence of God all have their source in that onrush of our sanguine impulses, and that sense of the exceedingness of the possible over the real. When, however, a positive intellectual content is associated with the faith state, it gets invincibly stamped upon belief, and this explains the passionate loyalty of the religious persons everywhere to the minutest details of their so widely differing creeds. Compare Luba, page 346 to 349. Taking creeds and faith state together as forming religions and treating these as purely subjective phenomena without regard to the question of their truth, we are obliged, on account of their extraordinary influence upon action and endurance, to class them amongst the most important biological functions of mankind. Their stimulant and anesthetic effect is so great that Professor Luba, in a recent article, goes so far as to say that so long as men can use their God, they care very little who he is, or even whether he is at all. The Contents of Religious Consciousness in the Monist, 11, page 536, July 1901. The truth of the matter can be put, says Luba, in this way. God is not known, he is not understood, he is used, sometimes as meat purveyor, sometimes as moral support, sometimes as friend, sometimes as an object of love. If he proves himself useful, the religious consciousness acts for no more than that. And see, that's one of the things we need to look at when we compare religions is, are they worshiping what they consider to be divinity from these various same aspects of good and truth or whatever? Does God really exist? How does he exist? What is he? Are so many irrelevant questions. Not God, but life. More life, a larger, richer, and more satisfying life, is, in the last analysis, the end of religion. The love of life at any and every level of development is the religious impulse. Location cited, page 571, 572, abridged. See also this writer's extraordinarily true criticism of the notion that religion primarily seeks to solve the intellectual mystery of the world. Compare what W. Bender says in his Wesen der Religion, Bonn, 1888, pages 85 and 38. Not the question about God and not the inquiry into the origin and purpose of the world is religion, but the question about man. All religious views of life are anthropocentric. Religion is what is that activity of human impulse towards self-preservation by means of which man seeks to carry his essential vital purposes through against the perverse pressure of the world by raising himself freely towards the world's ordering and governing powers when the limits of his own strength are reached. The whole book is little more than the development of these words. At the purely subjective rating, therefore, religion must be considered vindicated in a certain way from the attack of her critics. It would seem that she cannot be a mere anachronism and survival, but must exert a permanent function, whether she be with or without intellectual content, and whether, if she have any, it be true or false. We must next pass beyond the point of view of merely subjective utility and make inquiry into the intellectual content itself. First, is there, under all the discrepancies of the creeds, a common nucleus to which they bear their testimony unanimously? And second, ought we to consider the testimony true? I will take the first question first and answer it immediately in the affirmative. The warring gods and formulas of the various religions do indeed cancel each other, but there is a certain uniform deliverance in which religions all appear to meet and consist of two parts: an uneasiness and its solution. The uneasiness, reduced to its simplest terms, is a sense that there is something wrong about us as we naturally stand. The solution is a sense that we are saved from the wrongness by making proper connection with the higher powers. Well, Islam takes the approach that we're right from the start, and then if we mess up, then we've messed up. Then we can make the return, the tawbah. In those more developed minds which alone we are studying, the wrongness takes a moral character, and the salvation takes a mystical tinge. I think we shall keep well within the limits of what is common to all such minds if we formulate the essence of their religious experience in terms like these. The individual, so far as he suffers from his wrongness and criticizes it, is to that extent consciously beyond it, and in at least possible touch with something higher, if anything higher exists. Along with the wrong part, there is thus a better part of him, even though it may be but a most helpless germ, with which part he should identify his real being is by no means obvious at this stage, but when stage 2, the stage of solution or salvation, arrives. Remember that for some men it arrives suddenly, others gradually, whilst others, again, practically enjoy it all their life. That the man identifies his real being with the germinal higher part of himself, and does so in the following way. He becomes conscious that this higher part is conterminous and continuous with the more of the same quality which is operative in the universe outside of him, and which he can keep in working touch with, and in a fashion get on board of and save himself when all his lower being has gone to pieces in the wreck. It seems to me that all the phenomena are accurately described in these very simple general terms. The practical difficulties are to realize the reality of one's higher part, to identify oneself with it exclusively, and to identify it with all the rest of ideal being. They allow for the divided self and the struggle. They involve the change of personal center and the surrender of the lower self. They express the appearance of exteriority of the helping power and yet account for our sense of union with it. With mystical activity at its height, we find the consciousness possessed by the sense of being at once excessive and identical with the self, great enough to be God, interior enough to be me. The objectivity of it ought, in that case, to be called excessivity, rather our exceedingness. Recajac, Essai sur les fondements de la conscience mystique, 1897, page 46. And they fully justify our feelings of security and joy. There is probably no autobiographic document among all those which I have quoted to which the description will not well apply. One need only add such specific details as will adapt to various theologies and various personal temperaments, and one will then have the various experiences reconstructed in their individual forms. So far, however, as this analysis goes, the experiences are only psychological phenomena. They possess it as true, enormous biological worth. Spiritual strength really increases in the subject when he has them. A new life opens for him, and they seem to him a place, a conflux, where the forces of two universes meet, and yet this may be nothing but his subjective way of feeling things, a mood of his own fancy in spite of the effects produced. I now turn to my second question. What is the objective truth of their content? The word truth is here taken to mean something additional to bear value for life, although the natural propensity of man is to believe that whatever has great value for life is thereby certified as true. Now, sometimes people seek, that devil card of the tarot. Is that ignorance and evil? Well, there's good and truth that can be in the same area, at the very least, if it's not greater. But people think, well, I don't know. Some people, they, hence ignorance, they don't know where to get it from the other, or aren't waiting, or whatever. The part of the content concerning which the question of truth most pertinently arises is that more of the same quality with which our own higher self appears in the experience to come into harmonious working relation in such a more merely our own notion, or does it really exist? If so, in what shape does it exist? Does it act as well as exist? And in what form should we conceive of that union with it of which religious geniuses are so convinced? And we'll probably conclude that program in the next, that lecture in the next program.